Today is January 25, 2026. I want to go over this supposedly widening row between the United States and its so-called allies. This includes Europe. This also includes now Canada. And I want to point out the continuity of agenda that is taking place based in material realities. I want to show you that versus this political theater that is meant specifically to distract you away from that and serve as a form of perception management, public and political perception management. And the way I'm going to do this is because I'm working on a detailed, in-depth article on this. I'm going to do this particular video by just looking at some recent posts that I've made on X. And then I will show you the documented evidence backing up these conclusions. So first, let's look at this one. This was posted January 21st. The US, Greenland, Europe row is the perfect method of selling the US-Europe split. And it's in quotation marks because it's not a real split, necessary for the US's own publicly declared division of labor arrangement, where it tasks an obedient Europe with feeding itself into the proxy war with Russia next, while the US focuses more directly on China. And I just want to point out something here. US President Donald Trump, every time he talks about Greenland, tries to justify it by citing the threat of Russia and China. Do you remember people all clapping and cheering and optimistic that the recently published National Security Strategy, published November, December last year, it never mentioned Russia or China, even one time, as the major threat the US faces and that is driving US foreign policy? Do you remember people saying that? I pointed out how even in this paper, they don't mention Russia or China by name, but they are clearly referring to both nations when they talk about threats that the US is faced with, its interests are faced with as it helps itself to the nations, peoples, and resources of this planet. And now President Trump is just openly talking about how Russia and China are these threats, these looming threats that the US must take radical courses of action to face, including annexing the territory of a supposed allied nation, Denmark. So again, I warned that this was going to happen. I warned that people were cherry picking what they wanted to hear and read in that paper, and that the reality was exactly this: complete continuity, uninterrupted continuity of agenda from the previous Biden, first Trump administration, Obama administration, so on and so forth. In all other regards, Europe continues obediently serving US interests, from Iran to Venezuela to Russia and China, at Europe's own complete absolute expense. Again, if you completely ignore the political theater taking place, you ignore these headlines talking about how the leaders in Europe are having this serious confrontation and fallout with the United States, how President Trump is destroying transatlantic cooperation built on decades of efforts. If you completely ignore all of that and you come to this, this was January 23rd. Okay, so all of these events taking place within just a couple of days. France seizes suspected Russian shadow fleet oil tanker in the Mediterranean. Okay, so another tanker associated with Russian energy exports seized by France, a European nation, as part of continuing the US's own policies against Russia, its own proxy war it's waging against Russia, its own widening blockade it is imposing on Russia. Remember, it is now admitted in the New York Times that the United States, through the Central Intelligence Agency, is the one actually carrying out long-range drone strikes on Russian energy production deep inside Russian territory. And it is also carrying out maritime drone strikes on tankers supposedly moving Russian energy abroad, not just in the Black Sea, but also in the Mediterranean, also off the coast of West Africa. This is all admitted by the Western media itself. And so here is France, and every other European nation is participating in this, serving US interests even as they pretend to be opposed to them. So this is very important to keep in mind. And I say at their absolute own expense, because think back to, say, 2014 and then 2022, the United States overthrew the government of Ukraine and created this entire conflict in the first place, very deliberately. I showed you the Rand Corporation 2019 extending Russia policy paper, where they talk about, we'll use Ukraine to provoke a large-scale war with Russia to overextend them. And this has been done at Europe's expense. Before 2014, Europe was working very closely together with Russia. It was also increasingly working closer with China. And there was a bright future. And I remember writing articles about how bright that future would be if it continued along that trajectory. And of course, the United States in 2014 upended all of it. And then in 2022, they completed it. They forced Europe to cut themselves off completely from Russian energy imports. They have them now completely dependent on American and US proxies like Qatar. Now they are completely dependent on the US or nations the US has complete control over. They're no longer getting this energy from Russia. I've explained many times over the years how no matter what the United States does, exporting LNG to Europe, it will always be more expensive than just piping it in from Russia, unless you artificially jack up the prices of all energy everywhere. That's part of why they're doing this. These strikes on Russian energy production, these strikes on Russian energy tankers. Okay, so this is all happening at the absolute expense of Europe. You see the Western media itself reporting about the deindustrialization of Europe because they no longer have affordable energy prices. And it is impacting absolutely all aspects of life in Europe at the same time. So they're not doing this because it serves their interest. They're doing it because Europe, its leadership has been captured by the United States, and it serves American interests at the expense of Europe's interests. The idea that European nations need to bite the bullet because they need the US for security is absurd. It is absolutely absurd, because Europe has no actual enemies except the ones the US forces it to create in service of advancing US primacy worldwide. Again, go back to 2014, before the US violently overthrew the government of Ukraine and created this crisis in the first place. Europe was working very closely together with Russia. Relations were good, and they were getting better. There is no enemy that threatens Europe. France, the UK have nuclear weapons. Nobody is attacking Europe. Nobody is invading Europe. There are no enemies of Europe. No nation wants to go to war with Europe. No nation even has the ability to go to war with Europe, or anything to benefit from going to war with Europe. So the Europeans do not actually need the United States for security. They need the US for security to fight enemies like Russia, because the US created Russia as an enemy. They provoked Russia, and now they are forcing Europe as proxies to serve as a battering ram against Russia. It's not because Russia is an aggressor, it's because the US is using Europe to provoke Russia, and Russia is reacting to what Europe itself is doing. So the US is not needed for security in Europe. If the US packed up and went home, pulled all their troops out of Europe, and Europe slashed its defense spending in half, no one would come along, not now, not in 10 or 20 years, to invade or threaten Europe in any shape, form, or way. This is a fantasy. This is absolutely absurd. And this is the justification the Western media is making to sell this whole narrative to the public, or at least segments of the public. Before the US forced it into a proxy war with Russia, it was getting reliable, cheap energy from Russia, and it was the US, NATO, and Europe encroaching upon and threatening Russia, not the other way around. And this goes for China as well. Neither one of these nations is looking for a fight. I have covered US policy papers spanning decades, admitting that the Russian and Chinese military are built to defend Russia and China. They do not have the ability to project military power around the globe in the same way the US does, to actually, in reality, threaten other nations in the way the United States accuses Russia and China of doing in absolute fiction. There is no real row of any kind. Europe has long since been captured by US special interests. I would say this goes back decades. This theater is for pulling the public along a path Washington's European puppets are already obediently following and will continue following. And again, I just showed you the article, France seizing another Russian-linked tanker. They're doing exactly what the United States told them to. As a matter of fact, I'm going to do this again. It must be done. Let's go all the way back to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's comments in Brussels to Europe, February 12th, 2025, almost an entire year ago. The link will be in the video description below. And I'm going to read to you what he said, what he told Europe to do back in February. And then I will show you how Europe has not only obediently done all of these things, they're continuing to do it even as they pretend to have this falling out with the United States. Secretary Hegseth talks about, we need to end the conflict. It's not benefiting us, lip service to peace. But then he starts spelling out what the actual plan is to do. He says, a durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. And what he meant when he said this must not be Minsk 3.0 is, we don't want to make an agreement and then have the conflict begin again like the previous Minsk agreements. He's not saying we don't want to make an agreement with Russia and then violate it and force Russia to restart hostilities. We want to make sure that when Russia sees that we betrayed them, they don't have the ability to restart hostilities. Then he explains exactly how they're going to do it. He says any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops, but not American troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and that would not be covered under Article 5 because the US is using them as proxies. They don't want to get involved. There must also be robust international oversight of the line of contact, which indicates a freeze, not the resolution of the conflict, a freeze, a buffer zone, a freeze of the conflict, which is exactly what Russia said they will not tolerate. They will not accept it. To further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine, President Trump is unleashing American energy production. I was just talking about that. Not just unleashing American energy production and forcing Europeans to become dependent on it, but also now, as we know, the United States itself simply laundering these attacks through the Ukrainians is attacking Russian energy production, is attacking Russian energy exports. And you can argue that that's not having an impact on Russian energy production and exports, but they continuously expand this campaign, and if it continues to expand and nothing is done about it, it eventually will. It's not going to drive energy prices down. What it's going to do is make Russian energy exports untenable, which would only leave US energy exports, no matter how expensive, the only option on the table. Then he says, safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. The whole conflict in Ukraine is an American war on Russia by proxy. Has nothing to do with Europe except for the fact that the US has forced Europe to participate in its proxy war against Russia. And so what is he talking about here? He is talking about the division of labor, which I will get to here in just a moment. That's what he's talking about. In a division of labor, you're dividing the labor between different groups of people. You're not abandoning the project. You're simply forcing other members of your group to do different tasks. So they are tasking Europe with continuing the proxy war against Russia, and Secretary Hegseth admits this is to free up the US so it can go confront China, and in an equally unnecessary campaign of aggression and encroachment on China as it has carried out against Russia. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base, and importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. The threat facing Europe is who? Is what? Is Russia. And that's what he meant when he said that. So on one hand, the US poses as wanting peace with Russia, while at the same time saying Russia is a threat to Europe and Europe must ramp up military production. It must get militarily involved in Ukraine and must continue fighting who? Fighting Russia. Even if you don't mention Russia, that's what you're talking about. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense. So Secretary Hegseth is saying, European leaders, you need to convince your public that they need to spend more on defense, that this is existential and they need to spend more on defense. And that implies taking money that you're using for public programs, for the actual needs and desires of the European people, taking that funding away from what people in Europe actually need and funneling it into America's proxy war on Russia. 2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree. Later the same year, NATO members agreed a 5% defense spending increase. Everyone is being pulled into this reality TV show of transatlantic turmoil. And they are being pulled into the conservative, liberal antagonism. They've all picked sides and they're rooting for their team. But in reality, there is no split. There is no turmoil. Europe is obediently doing exactly what the US told them to do. And the turmoil, the political theater, is to distract you away from the fact that Europe is doing what the US told them to do, which is to feed them into America's war of proxy on Russia. European leaders cannot tell their people, their population, you guys have to give up all of your programs, all of our public spending. It's all coming to an end because the US wants to feed us into a proxy war. You cannot tell the European public that. They will not accept that. So what Secretary Hegseth himself told European leaders to do back in February was leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Lie to them through war propaganda about the threat Russia poses to Europe, when in fact we started this conflict and Russia is simply reacting to it. And you need to speak frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by more spending on defense, which means less spending on actual things European people need, from 2% of your GDP to 5% of your GDP, and possibly even beyond that. And then Secretary Hegseth talks about, we also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. China does not threaten the American homeland in any shape, form, or way, and all that's left is America's core national interests in the Indo-Pacific, where the United States is not actually located. So again, this is the US helping itself to a region of the planet on the opposite side of the planet from where it's actually located, and citing China's reaction to American encroachment as some sort of hostility the United States needs to react to. So it says the US is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific. They don't mean China wants to fight a war with the US and we must deter this because the Chinese are aggressors. What he's talking about is the US is threatening China. China is going to react and it's going to try to defend itself. And what the US needs to do is prevent China from even thinking about starting any sort of conflict with the US, essentially capitulate to US demands within China's own region of the world, even within China's own borders. And then Secretary Hegseth says this all must be done recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. Together, we can establish a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. The US is not abandoning or splitting from Europe. They are telling Europe, Ukraine is depleted. They're going to collapse. You're next. You're online next. And the European leaders all said, yes, we will do that. It's not as if the people saying, yes, they will do that are the ones that are actually going to pay the cost of this policy. It'll be the ordinary European public that pay the cost for this policy, just like inside Ukraine itself. The Ukrainian government does not serve the Ukrainian people's interests in any shape, form, way, does not represent them. They were put into power by the US. They serve US interests at the expense of not just Ukrainian interests, but its own actual existence. And then he says the United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and to the defense partnership with Europe, full stop. And then he continues because he doesn't understand what full stop means. But the United States will no longer tolerate an imbalanced relationship which encourages dependency. And yet the United States is the one that created this dependency in Europe in the first place. They will not tolerate European independence of any kind. That is why the EU, the European Union, this layered bureaucracy, was thrown over the individual nations of Europe to smother and suffocate national sovereignty across all of Europe. That the US, special interest driving US foreign policy, did that. The largest, most powerful corporations and financial institutions runs both the United States and Europe and everyone in between, all across the so-called Western world. What he's doing here is simply saying, this is another thing we Americans can use to sell this to the American public, why we're doing this. We don't want the Europeans to be dependent on us. And Europeans, you tell your people, you lie to them, and you say, we need to spend more on defense. The Americans are abandoning us, and Russia poses an existential threat. So it's all the lies Secretary Hegseth laid out and said, we must tell these lies to our respective populations to sell this division of labor, because that's what it is. It's not a split, it's a division of labor. This was just this month, earlier, January 2026, US balks at UK, France pledge troops to post-war Ukraine. This is literally what Secretary Hegseth told them to do, and that is exactly what they're doing. And yet the Western media is posing as if Europe's going off and doing this on their own because the US and Europe have this huge divide, and yet they're doing exactly what Secretary Hegseth told them to do last year. He told them to do it, and if you ignore all of the political theater and you look at the material realities unfolding on the ground, both in the US, all across Europe, within Ukraine, they're doing exactly what they were told to do by Secretary Hegseth. And everything that they are saying politically, publicly, across the media designed to manage public perception, not inform the public, is meant to distract you away from the fact that the US is simply feeding Europe into a proxy war of its own making, and European leaders are complicit in obediently participating in this policy. Another article, January 7, 2026, UK and France to send troops to Ukraine, a peace deal agreed. And there's no peace deal. There's no peace deal. No one's talking about a peace deal. They're talking about freezing the conflict, sending Western troops in. It will literally be Minsk 3.0. It is the betrayal of any sort of concept of peace with Russia. But it won't be Minsk 3.0 in the sense that because the European troops are in there and the threat for all-out war between Russia and Europe would be so high, the Russians would hesitate to restart hostilities, knowing that they would likely be facing a war against all of Europe. Now, let's talk about Greenland, because this plays a huge role in all of this. If you are performing a division of labor and you're tasking Europe with feeding itself into your proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, and there is this threat that Russia may end up fighting an armed conflict with Europe, either outright or to a greater degree than it already is, because that is essentially what's happening. It's a US-European war against Russia by proxy. You're the United States and you don't want to get sucked up into this conflict. You are feeding Europe into it next. You have no intention of feeding yourself into it. That's why it's a proxy war. Where do you go? If your commanders are in Germany directing every aspect of the war on Russia and Ukraine, and you have your logistics set up in Poland and in Romania, what do you do if now you're going to take all of Europe where you're overseeing this proxy war, you're feeding it in? Where do you go? You go to the next closest place that allows you to do this. You go to Greenland. I showed people on the global map. If you're looking at Ukraine here, Russia, Moscow, Western Russia, where most of its population and industry is located, and you have Romania, you have Poland. These are the places the US is using to stage equipment and support logistically for Ukraine. And we know, because the New York Times told us, US commanders are overseeing every aspect of the war in Ukraine from a base in Germany. But if you're now feeding Europe into this proxy war next, where do you go? You go somewhere where you still have your proxies between you and the country you are targeting, Russia. And if you look at Greenland, it is the perfect place to do this. And President Trump himself has repeatedly stated, we want Greenland because of the threat of Russia and China. And I have already explained how the northern route, China, Russia, using these Arctic waters, and how one gateway goes here, the Bering Strait, Alaska, and Russia, and here is the other gateway. And so if you have your forces in Greenland or Iceland, if you're building up a military presence here, that allows you to strangle this northern route. It also puts US military forces so much closer to Russia in case there is a direct conflict. You still have all of Canada and the United States here. You cannot look at it as a traditional map. You have to look at the battlefield like this. You are here, you are fighting Russia here, and you have all of this space in between. You're not fighting around the equator like people somehow imagine you would because they're looking at these projected maps. Now, let me continue. On supposed turmoil within the West and its true purpose, and let's talk about Canada and Greenland, and then I'm going to go get into this a lot deeper here. US policy papers have, for many years, talked about the desperate need to consolidate the economies, industry, and military power of its allies, or you could say more accurately, proxies, in order to confront and contain a rising China. Do you remember under the Biden administration, 2023, the National Defense Industrial Strategy? I went over this in depth. And this whole paper is about why is the United States failing to outproduce even just Russia in this proxy war taking place in Ukraine? How come the United States cannot even match, let alone exceed, Russian military industrial production? And they talked about all of the things that I have been talking about for years. They're talking about their profit-driven military-industrial base. They're talking about human resources, the failure of the American education system to provide sufficient numbers of people capable of working technical jobs in an industrial base, especially a military-industrial base. And they talk about how the only way, because the obstacles for the US to expand its own military-industrial base are so large and would take so many years to overcome. The only realistic way to do this is to leverage their allies, their partners. And it says in this paper right here, integrated deterrence requires the close collaboration with allies and partners and deepens interoperability across a full spectrum of capabilities. They're talking about foreign military sales, has the additional benefit of helping to achieve economies of scale by sharing some of the burdens of acquisition and sustainment across the life cycle of these defense platforms. This is just one example in this 60-page report where they talk about how they will consolidate control over all of their proxies, their military-industrial base, and put it to work for advancing US foreign policy, even if it happens at the expense of their so-called partners. That was under the Biden administration. And then the Trump administration, the national security strategy, has a whole section titled Burden Sharing and Burden Shifting. So they're talking about President Trump's approach of asking allies to assume primary responsibility for the regions. The United States will organize a burden sharing network, which it will lead, with our government as convener and supporter. So it's not asking Europe, take care of Europe for Europeans. It says, take care of Europe for US interests. Japan and South Korea, you will take care of the Asia Pacific in terms of our interests. You're going to build our weapon systems and then ship them back to the US so that we can use them to advance our foreign policy objectives, not your foreign policy objectives. South Korea, you will start working on our fleet. We don't have the resources to expand shipbuilding. You will do it for us, and it will be at your expense, not ours. And this is what has been taking place since the Biden administration, and then just accelerating rapidly under the Trump administration. And I actually remember telling people when this came out back in 2023, and I talked about how all of these think tanks imagine the US can, on paper, they're like, well, between the US and China outmatches us. But if you add up the United States, Canada, all of Europe, Australia, Japan, South Korea, well, now it's becoming a little bit more even. And I made the point then that maybe on paper that's true, but in terms of practical application, China has these huge resources under one government, under one system, with one strategy, with one legal system. All of this has to happen within. Amongst a population that all speak the same language, they all live together within the same borders, and the United States is talking about this on paper, where if you add it all up, now we have more ships and more planes. But now you're talking about coordinating all of these different nations. How do you fix that? You aggressively assert control over these proxies by stripping away what's left of their sovereignty, because there's not much sovereignty left in nations like Canada, Australia, the European Union. They don't really have local national sovereignty. They answer to the corporations and financial institutions that run Wall Street and Washington. They answer to them, and there's very little left of their actual sovereignty. But it still exists, and there are still barriers, political, sociological barriers, between the US and what it wants to use all of these proxies for and what they could openly get away with doing. And they're pushing it to the max with this proxy war in Ukraine. You see Secretary Hegseth himself saying we need to concoct these excuses to convince our respective populations to go along with this. And so if you're going to consolidate control over Canada, Europe, you're going to annex territory, in Greenland, you're going to do all of these things, you require a greater degree and a much more accelerated timeline of getting the things you need to do to add all of this up and use it effectively against China. And so again, continuity of agenda. This started under the Biden administration. It started long before that even, but just looking at the Biden administration and then the second Trump administration, continuity of agenda, absolutely. They started it aggressively under the Biden administration. They continued it under the Trump administration. The only thing that changed were the narratives, the lies used to sell it. That is what we're seeing with U.S. demands increasing regarding Canada and Greenland, the outright seizure of Venezuela and its resources, and declared control over its economy. There is no way for the U.S. to confront China as an alliance. It needs to centrally control all of these resources of its proxies directly, and that is what is being set up here. And even as the EU play acts opposition to this, it itself is consolidating control over whatever remains of European sovereignty ahead of eventually and eagerly handing it all over to the US, because that's what the EU has always been. It's been an exercise of consolidating control over Europe and preventing individual European nations from saying, this doesn't serve our interests and we don't want to do this. This is serving America's interests. That's what you hear the leadership of Hungary talking about right now, how this is about the US and hegemony. It has nothing to do with us. Russia is not a threat to us, and we're being pulled along in this direction anyway. Well, that's what the EU is supposed to do. It's supposed to silence them and overrule them, and that's what we see happening. So no, the West isn't divided or distracted from its confrontation with either Russia or China. This is all in order to enhance and accelerate its conflict with both nations. So, people are wishfully thinking, oh, look at the West. They're turning against each other and they're going to collapse in disarray, and hooray for multipolarism. No more threat from the United States, but it's not true. The US is enhancing its menace to the rest of the world because it is consolidating openly and aggressively consolidating control over all of its proxies. And despite the headlines and the narratives of, transatlantic turmoil, you see Europe doing literally every single thing the US tells them to do. The political theater versus the material realities of what is actually happening. anyone in Beijing or Moscow who think they can play along and create conflict within the West during this process are simply wasting time. They need to prepare for the extreme escalation that is already in the process of unfolding against them. Stop falling for US reality TV show style drama meant to reel everyone in and distract them from the big picture. And the big picture is America is still pursuing global primacy, more desperately and more dangerously than ever. So I talked about France. We don't like the US, we don't like what President Trump is doing, but we're still gonna fight their proxy war against Russia for them. And now Canada. Let's talk about Canada, because I saw this. Trump threatens Canada with 100% tariffs if it makes a deal with China. And I see so many people, again, I don't know if they really believe this or they're just pandering to their audiences, telling them what they want to hear. And I will show you the material reality of Canada's relationship with the United States versus the fantastical relationship people imagine. They imagine that Canada is finally standing up to the US. I have people asking me, can Canada fight the US using guerrilla warfare? This is all absolutely, utterly ridiculous. Canada is already so economically, militarily, and politically integrated with the US, it has no practical agency or independence. Look past the political theater and see the material realities. Let's see the material realities. This is where Canada exports all of its goods and resources and services. The United States, overwhelmingly. Over 75%. China is a blip. It's a blip. And even compared to Europe, China is just there compared to all of Europe. Let's look at imports. Again, well over half of all of their imports come from the United States. China is there. It's sizable, but negligible. Are you going to tell me that Canada is going to seriously risk its stability, political, economic stability, over just slightly, taking this from 9.8% and maybe ratcheting it up to 10%? Do you think they're actually going to threaten political and economic stability with the US over that? And the answer is no. This is theater. Let's continue. What we're watching is part of wider political theater where the US is declaring its new global rules and making examples of those who don't follow them. That applies to Venezuela. They said, we own the Western Hemisphere, and anyone that defies us, we will literally murder you, kidnap you, or murder you. That's what we will do. And then they kidnapped the president of Venezuela. They murdered hundreds of Venezuelans in a war of aggression, very short, but still a war of aggression nonetheless. And now they are saying Canada, actually they're saying no one's going to do business with China. And here's Canada saying, we're going to still do business. You can't tell us what to do, even though it's all complete theater. And the US will make an example out of them to set a precedent for other nations the US doesn't actually completely control, so that they can set the precedent and then apply this pressure to nations that actually are considering working more closely with China. Countries like Thailand, where I'm based, for example. So this theater with Canada is wholly artificial. The rule is China must be isolated. Canada, who has no genuine interest in working with China and no significant relationship with China. Really, when you look at this, there's no serious relationship Canada has with China. If all that trade disappeared overnight, Canada would continue being Canada. If all of its trade with the US, exports and imports, were shut off, Canada would be sucked up into an economic black hole. And you cannot expand your trade with China fast enough to compensate for that. And everybody should know that. Shouldn't even have to explain that. So the rule is China must be isolated. Canada, who has no genuine interest in working with China, will set the precedent and example for other nations not fully captured by the US of what will happen if they don't agree to isolate China. Years ago, the US declared the need to consolidate control over its proxies. That goes back to the Biden administration, the National Defense Industrial Strategy, and now the National Security Strategy under the Trump administration. They have both emphasized the fact that America alone cannot continue pursuing primacy. It needs to consolidate control over its proxies and use them more aggressively. That is the consensus. Republican, Democratic, doesn't matter who is in the White House, who is controlling Congress. That is what the unelected corporate financier special interests actually driving U.S. foreign policy. That is what they said is going to happen, and that is what is happening. And U.S. official U.S. government papers have reiterated this necessity under both the Biden and Trump administrations. I showed you where they did. In order to successfully confront and defeat a rising China. Again, the U.S. does not have enough. They think all of their proxies combined on paper come somewhere close to equaling China, but they need to exercise more direct control over these proxies. As it is right now under the status quo, the U.S. does not directly control them to the degree they would need to successfully confront and overpower China. That is what we're watching. And that is what it has been and is doing both in America, in the Americas, across the Atlantic, in Europe, and everywhere else. This theater is meant to manage public and political perception as it does. So that's all this political theater is meant to do. It's meant to draw people into the drama. People that are conservative or liberal, they're going to pick their sides and root for their team, and they're all going to miss the big picture where the U.S. is simply consolidating control over these proxies they already have politically captured, and they're going to use them in an unprecedented way, more aggressively than ever, to encircle, contain, divide, and destroy nations like Russia, Iran, and China, and they will do it at the expense of their proxies, not themselves. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below. Every single video, I will include all of the links that I reference, as well as for other places you can find and follow my work. I post my videos on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Telegram. Also in the video description are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation or donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare, just liking and sharing my videos or posting a positive comment or sending a news tip. All of these things help make this work possible. It is all greatly appreciated. I thank you sincerely, and as always, thank you for watching.